You've got 4 days left before you go over the sandbags into the dark. This is what the army feeds you on it. 6 ounces of meat, if the ration party even makes it up the trench, a biscuit hard enough to crack a molar, half a gill of rum from a jar marked SRD, which men swore stood for Seldom Reaches Destination. But food is the smallest problem this week, because 2 nights from now, with a knife blackened so it won't catch moonlight, you crawl into no man's land and kill a stranger with your hands. That's the actual math of a trench raider's week. Not the raid itself. That's 20 minutes, if it goes well. The other 6 days and 23 hours are spent being kept just fed enough, just rested enough, and just sane enough to still be capable of it when the whistle doesn't come. Because raiders don't get whistles. They get a tap on the shoulder in the dark. Start with the food, because the food tells you everything about how the army actually saw you. On paper, a British soldier was owed close to 1.25 pounds of fresh meat a day, plus bread, cheese, jam, and enough calories to hit the 3,574 a dietitian had calculated a man needed to fight. In practice, by 1916, the meat ration had been cut to 6 ounces, and men in the front line sometimes went days without any of it at all, because the Germans had found the range to the communication trenches and the ration party simply didn't arrive. What did arrive was tinned corned beef, called bully, in such endless supply that men grew to hate the smell of it before they'd even opened the tin. Cooking a hot meal in a forward trench was close to impossible, so most of it was eaten cold, straight from the can, unless someone had carried up a Tommy cooker, a folding tin stove barely bigger than a matchbox, and could get it lit without the smoke drawing a sniper's eye. The bread ration got worse as the war went on too. By the winter of 1916, flour was so scarce that loaves were cut with ground turnip, and the daily bread issue was 10 men to a loaf, sawed into fractions with a bayonet. If bully beef ran short, the alternative was a tin called Maconochies, a stew of beef and turnip that men rated as barely edible warm and openly disgusting cold, which mattered because cold was how you usually got it. On top of all this, every raider carried what were called iron rations sewn into his kit, a can of beef, a few of those tooth-cracking biscuits, and a sealed tin of tea and sugar that could only legally be opened with an officer's permission, because the food inside was meant to be the difference between a man making it back to his own line or collapsing in a shell hole somewhere in between. Tea itself wasn't a comfort so much as a disguise. It masked the taste of water that had been carried up to the line in old petrol cans, and a man who'd learned to stop noticing the taste of petrol in his tea had learned something about the rest of his week too. None of that would matter much, except that in 48 hours you're going to need every calorie of it, and there's a decent chance you won't get it. But calories are the easy problem. The next one is sleep, and sleep is where the system actually starts working against you. You are not issued 8 hours. You are issued a firestep, a narrow ledge cut into the front wall of the trench, and whatever dry sandbag you can find to sit on. One veteran described the whole routine as simple as pulling his greatcoat over his head like a tent and trying to doze sitting upright, because there was nowhere to lie down, and no time allotted for it anyway. Sentry duty ran on a 2-hour rotation, and falling asleep on that duty was a capital offence, punishable by firing squad, which tends to concentrate a tired man's attention. Even off-duty, sleep came in broken stretches of an hour or less, interrupted by shelling, by working parties, by the cold, and by the rats. The rats were not incidental. Some estimates put more rats in a stretch of trench than soldiers. And they were bold enough to run across a sleeping man's face and steal food directly from his pocket while he lay there. Add that to whatever sleep you were losing anyway. There was no schedule to any of it either. A man might get pulled from a half sleep on the firestep to carry ammunition, to dig, To stand a working party in the freezing dark for 2 hours and then be told to try sleeping again with 20 minutes left before dawn stand to, when every man in the trench was required on the firestep whether he'd slept or not, because dawn and dusk were when an attack was most likely to come. Multiply that across 4 or 5 days in the line, and by the time your name gets called for the raid, you are not going into no man's land rested. You are going in on a sleep debt that would get you sent home from a normal job, expected to move without a sound, think clearly, and kill quietly, if it comes to that. That's the improvisation the system asks of you just to stay upright. And it gets worse from here. Because the body doesn't just need calories and sleep, it needs to not be actively rotting, and the trenches were not built for that. Every man in the line had lice, no exceptions. They bred in the seams of a uniform that hadn't been off his back in weeks. By 1918, army doctors finally confirmed what the men had suspected for years, that the lice were spreading trench fever, a disease that could put a man in a rear hospital for up to 12 weeks with headaches and a fever that came back in waves. Standing for days in water that never drained rotted the skin off a man's feet from the inside, a condition bad enough in its worst cases to end in gangrene and amputation. Which is why officers made their men rub whale oil into their feet every single day, whether they wanted to or not. The latrines overflowed into the mud when the shelling cut the drainage, and somewhere close always, there was a smell that men who survived the war never fully described to their families, because there wasn't a clean way to say it. Delousing, when it happened at all, meant a hot bath and a clean uniform maybe once every few weeks, and it barely mattered, because lice eggs survived in the seams no matter how hard the fabric was scrubbed. And the moment a man's body heat came back up inside a freshly issued shirt, they hatched all over again. Men swapped the same joke up and down the line, that the only soldier in the whole army who never once complained about lice was the one who'd stopped feeling anything at all. This is what you are standing in, sleeping in, and eating in for 4 more days. And at the end of those 4 days, none of it, not the hunger, not the exhaustion, not the lice, is the thing that actually kills you. That's still coming. Because on the night the raid actually goes, everything about how you've been living for the last week becomes the whole plan. You black your face with burnt cork so it won't catch the moon. You leave your rifle behind, because a rifle is loud and useless in a 4-foot trench, and instead you carry a knife that's been deliberately blued or blackened so the steel won't flash when you raise your arm. A knuckle duster punch dagger with a spike built to go between a man's ribs before he can shout, or, if you're improvising, a sharpened entrenching tool that does the job just as well and looks a lot less like a weapon of war if anyone finds it on you. You carry 10 bombs, a sandbag, and a password, because coming back through your own wire in the dark with jumpy sentries on either side has killed more raiders than the Germans have. Some raiders went further than a knife. American units in particular favored the M1897 pump shotgun, a weapon so effective at clearing a confined stretch of trench in seconds that the Germans considered it a war crime and reportedly executed any American they captured carrying one. Most men, though, put their faith in something quieter. A British-made push dagger had a T-shaped handle you gripped like a fist, with the blade sitting between your index and middle fingers, blackened at the point so it wouldn't catch even a sliver of moonlight while you were still 40 yards from the wire. None of it was issued by the quartermaster in the neat way a rifle was. Most of these blades were hammered out by hand from whatever scrap steel a company armorer could find, because the war had produced no factory anywhere fast enough to arm men for the one job that mattered most, which was killing in total silence at arm's length before the other man could open his mouth. The Canadians built a whole reputation on this. By late 1915, a lieutenant colonel named Victor Odlum had worked out a version of the raid precise enough that 170 volunteers could go out, blow apart a stretch of German line, take prisoners, and come home having lost 2 men. Word of that ratio travelled. Within 2 years, the French were sending their own officers to Canadian headquarters to be taught how it was done. And the Germans had started calling the Canadian Corps their elite soldiers, not as a compliment. One tactic the Canadians ran nightly, nicknamed Silent Death by the men who did it, had a small party crawl into no man's land after dark and simply wait, motionless in the mud and the frost, for a German patrol to walk into them. When one did, it ended with a blackened blade and total silence, and the Germans on that stretch of front eventually stopped sending patrols out at all, because the men who went never came back, and nobody ever heard what happened to them. That is what the 4 days of bad meat, an hour of sleep at a time, and lice under your collar were actually preparing you for. Not a battle with a front and a back you could retreat behind, but 20 minutes of total silence in the dark, cutting wire by feel, killing at arm's length, and getting back through your own line before a nervous sentry puts a bullet in you by mistake. 20 minutes, most nights. That's all the raid itself usually took. It was the 6 days and 23 hours around it, the starving, the not sleeping, the surviving your own trench before you ever reached the enemy's, that made a man capable of doing it at all, and that decided whether he'd be steady enough to do it again the following week. So the next time someone describes trench warfare as men sitting still in mud for 4 years, you can tell them it wasn't stillness. It was 6 ounces of meat and an hour of stolen sleep over and over, building toward 20 minutes where none of that was allowed to matter anymore. The question worth sitting with isn't whether they were brave enough to go over the sandbags. It's whether anyone could be kept fed and rested and sane enough week after week to keep doing it and call that surviving.